talk about numerous clubs here and numerous examples, is a disconnect sometimes between owners and fans in that regard, and that's where you can see some conflict at times. Again, an NFL deal, a Formula One go-karting track underneath the stadium, Taylor Swift concerts, Beyonce concerts, it's much bigger again than football, but they know that ultimately the owners at the minute are trying to do the very best for the club and leave it in a better position than they found it.
Welcome back to The Football Economy, the podcast where we unpack the business, governance, and financial forces shaping the beautiful game. I'm Ibrahim.
And I'm Martin. We're here to dive into the numbers, the policies, and the passion that keeps football ticking from the Premier League to the grassroots, basically.
Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Dan Plumley, sport lecturer in sport finance at Sheffield Hallam University. Dan's a leading voice on the economics of professional sports, with research spanning governance, competitive balance, and a unique bond between clubs and fans. He's also a chartered global management accountant and a regular media commentator on football finance.
Professor Dan, it's fantastic to have you here on the Football Economy. Welcome aboard.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Dan, we've come across a few of your articles, but let's focus on the social contract theory in football. So what drew you to this idea? How does it apply to relationship between clubs and their supporters?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that one. It's probably a little bit outside of my comfort zone, so to speak. Very much a finance person. Quantitative analysis has been my kind of go-to, but this one was with a colleague, a good friend of mine at Northumbria University, Dr. Mark Middelin, who's been involved in some research looking at the perceived social contract between fans and owners of clubs, and that delves wider into kind of social contract theory around organisations and how they interact with customers as well. But with football, of course, that is heightened by the emotional connection between fans and their club. And what we were trying to do there is unpack that through a series of interviews with stakeholder groups, representatives on supporter trusts, and relevant people that have a kind of voice within their clubs, but in English football, not a direct ownership stake or a say in the boardroom. And there's some interesting findings there about the perception of what fans perceive to be the expectations of owners, and likewise what they think that the owners' expectations should be of them. And it does throw up some interesting dynamics. And I guess to talk to one example that we've seen at the very highest level, which we did a bit of a media piece on off the back of that article, was the Manchester United example of coming out and saying we need to raise ticket prices to comply with PSR regulations. And it cuts across exactly that article. It's about two sides of that fence there. You've got the fans that are expecting the club's expecting the fans to pay money for their ticket prices, which is a legitimate thing to expect, but blaming that on the context of not being able to comply with the financial regulations, with financial sustainability being very much an expectation of the owners. So we were looking at that through the lens of this kind of perceived social contract, and actually do they contradict at certain times? And I think what we've seen wider with that in the industry, and we could talk about numerous clubs here and numerous examples, is a disconnect sometimes between owners and fans in that regard, and that's where you can see some conflict at times.
Professor Dan, research shows fans stick with clubs for things like stadia and colors and not just results. And why does this deeper bond make football's social contract so unique compared to other industries?
It really is unique, and you're absolutely right. And I often use the analogy of any other industry that we want to talk about here. So if you look at how the things that people have to do to live, think about the way you do your shopping in a supermarket sense, think about the way you purchase your clothes, those decisions that you make. It's kind of commonplace that people will change supplier in that regard from time to time. They might choose to shop at a different supermarket if things are a little bit cheaper. They might like a brand of clothes, but they will also buy other brands. In football, historically, certainly for certain generations, particularly the kind of middle-aged to older generation that we're in now, there is only one club. They won't change their club. And clubs know that. They can exploit that, don't get me wrong, as well, in terms of ticket prices, as we're talking about season tickets, or merchandise, the price of replica shirts, etc., all those examples. But they know that you will not change your club, and it's highly likely that you would speak to some fans of football clubs and you could offer them free tickets or free season tickets at their rival for life, and they wouldn't go for it. They would choose to pay at the club that they support. And I just don't think you get that in any other industry. I think, we can talk about the entertainment world, and people will follow pop stars or movie stars, but they will also listen to other bands and other artists, and they'll watch other movies. It really is unique within football, and I guess there is a bit of a generational thing to look at now in terms of what younger people want, and we know that they are following players maybe sometimes more than clubs nowadays, which again you can see kind of strategies to buy certain players and how clubs might leverage that. But I do think running through the core of that, you have got that loyalty in a fan base that is pretty much non-existent in any other industry.
Right. And so just to come back to the loyalty, I mean, to focus on the sort of the fans side of things. So we do know that from the fan-led review, so if it says that 89% of fans do support more regulation when it comes to club finances, which is from the documents, the fan-led review. So does this suggest that the social contract is breaking down under the current ownership model? And if so, what would you say would be the way to mitigate for this?
Yeah, I think in parts it does prove that point, and some of the findings from that particular paper that myself and my colleague put together would highlight that. I think there is a breakdown in certain parts. I do think as well it does depend on the fans of clubs that we are talking about at certain times, and I think every case study there, it kind of has to be looked at individually in its own right at certain moments in time. And I think one thing that is also tricky to balance there that we have seen play out is when things are going well on the pitch, there is less conflict between fans and owners, generally speaking. It tends to be that some of those breakdowns come when things are not going so well on the pitch, or there's financial difficulties, or both. And if you have both, then you run into some real difficulties. So I do think sometimes it can be situational. And I guess a good example here that we could talk to is, let's look at Newcastle United for a moment as an example in English football, and look at financial sustainability, club ownership, and success on the pitch. That football club was a profitable football club under the previous owner, Mike Ashley. It was a very tight financial ship. The finances looked pretty good. The balance sheet was good. They were sustainable as a club, but that wasn't delivering them success on the pitch. The fans were in conflict with the owner. They were saying there was a bit of a dull style of football. They weren't sure what the vision was, etc., etc. And fast forward a couple of years, and now the takeover by the PIF has put that club into loss-making territory. But they've needed to do that to try and bridge the financial gap to compete. But then, of course, they're running up against the regulations, as we say. But they have just won their first trophy in 70 years. And you can look at it's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. There's financial sustainability, which is important, but there's also owner motives, owner strategy, owner direction, deep pockets and deeper pockets for the next phase to come through and progress on the pitch. And ultimately then, of course, fans want success as well, and that often means buying more expensive players in the transfer market, paying more in wages, as we've seen throughout history, and also, of course, trying to deliver success in terms of trophies or titles or qualification for Europe. So I think that one's a really nice example of how those things can collide. And I guess in terms of the regulation point that you mentioned, none of us, and I've been involved in that fan-led review as well, we're not suggesting that regulation is a bad thing. And I think we're all some of us are of the opinion that actually we shouldn't need regulation in the football industry, but here we are and we kind of have to do it. And part of that is the ownership piece, but it is really tricky because you could speak to the same set of fans kind of 2 years apart, and their opinions on ownership and regulation would probably change dependent on where they are on the pitch.
That's a good point. And going back to the hiking ticket prices the example from Manchester United. So your paper hinted that these owners who ignore the social contract are, we could call them dictators. What's your take on that? And how do we shift their mindset? Because they always have to take into account the fans. They will be for life, but how to deal with them.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think you're getting into ownership motives as well. We're kind of stepping away from the numbers. And of course, we don't always know the ownership motives unless they come out openly and say that, and that's very tricky due to the communication piece that we're talking about as well. So you're trying to look for kind of clues in the way in which the group or the individual is owned and structured and their motives, and it can be very different. So as you say, if you've just got one person that has direct control over the club, there is a possibility that could become a bit of a dictatorship, and we have seen that example play out and where it's gone drastically wrong in some cases. We've also got kind of consortiums. Look at American private equity firms that have been investing heavily in European and English football as an example, and we think their motive is a clear return on investment strategy. It's 7 to 10 years, it's cheap acquisition, it's invest, but it's profit maximisation in the end of it, and they'll take a return. We talk about the Glazers and their takeover of Manchester United, and very much a profit maximisation strategy that follows the American sports model. We're looking at the Middle East and sovereign state wealth funds, and it's not really about the money, it's about leverage of something else. We could look at Wrexham and the two Hollywood A-listers. There's lots of different motives within there, but I guess what those owners all need to consider with whatever club that they're buying, for me certainly, is they need to understand the industry, they need to understand the league, the culture, the history, they need to understand the club. And some of the best owners that I've spoken to and chief execs that have worked with owners, they'll talk about themselves being the custodians of the club, not the owners. And that can be really powerful when you're communicating that well to the fan base, because if you can get the fans on board with that message as well, to go to your point there, Martin, they'll be really receptive of that for the most part, because they know that owners will come and go, but they know that ultimately the owners at the minute are trying to do the very best for the club and leave it in a better position than they found it. And I think if you can get that right, and it's not easy, there's still risk with that, but if you can get that message right and the communication piece, and you tell the fans those kind of things, ultimately fans then become more on board with whatever it is you're trying to do, and owners can get themselves some real credit there by just the understanding piece and the communication piece.
Right. So just to go deeper when it comes to the owners, so what's your perspective when it comes to like an owner test? I know that's something that the football regulator would be heavily focused on. How realistic is that going to be going forward? Because when you look at the sort of like looking at it from a general perspective, from a top-down perspective, the government significantly has a say in the way football clubs are being regulated and run, with the football regulator being introduced. We know FIFA, according to the doctrine, they rather have no political interference, but then you have state-backed clubs who are then obviously heavily investing in these football clubs, and then have influence on the government because of all the investments outside of football that they do have, like the Heathrow airports, for instance, when it comes to Qatar, not specifically focused on that, but the Russian oligarchs who have significant investments in the UK or London, so real estate markets. How does that balance work when it comes to the independent football regulator? That's one. And then number two, how would you say the expectations are going forward for the credibility of the football regulator to be well received? How should we as fans and observers and practitioners expect the vetting of that specific football regulator in terms of who that person would be?
Yeah, this is where it gets really complex, doesn't it? And often again, we focus on the football, but you're absolutely right. These ownership decisions are much bigger than football often, and span political and geopolitical landscapes. So we have to be mindful of that. And I think the ultimate answer to your first part of your question is we kind of are where we are with that now. Some of that has already happened, and we have to be mindful of that. But there are owners in clubs already that, of course, have political links, and there's a bigger picture in terms of some of the deals they would do government to government and things like that. So we can't kind of go in and retrospectively unpick that at this point in time. We have to be aware that it is there, and I guess that one of the overarching criticisms, and you mentioned FIFA, will always be we think that we should be able to separate sport and politics, but we can't. And on the question of an independent regulator, there's also the question of, is anything ever truly independent, given what you've just alluded to? So there's an awareness point on that, but we can't really do too much about that with the way it's shaping up. I think what the regulator will be able to do in English football, and having been involved in some of the discussions and working with people who are working more directly within that space, it will have more legally binding powers to look at the owners and the new owners and directors test coming in. So if you are a new owner coming into the market or a new kind of boardroom level person, there'll be more stringent checks now done. The regulator will have more resource to perform those checks and balances. The ownership test in English football has been heavily criticised for not being robust enough. And ultimately, a lot of that comes down to the test itself, but also the resource to deal with it. You know, the EFL and the Premier League have got a lot of other competing interests, and the resource has just perhaps not been there to put in to do that. So the regulator should help with that in the future. And it will have more, as I say, legally binding powers through government to be able to look at the people coming in more detail. And if they don't think that they are the right people to be owning football clubs for whatever reason, whether it's lack of financial information or credibility or other issues that it digs up through the due diligence background checks, it will be able to put a block on at that point in terms of entry into the market. What it will also do in the future, it's not to say that there's going to be a kind of step change there in terms of extracting current owners from that system, because they're already in and that it has its own challenges. But what it will be able to do again is to force more compliance on them in terms of if they don't submit things on time or they don't submit the paperwork or there's evidence of some things that have changed, the finances have changed, there's kind of bad practice happening within that particular club. It will give the regulator will have powers to go in legally and to investigate. So I think that's where I would see the kind of long-term future for the English game under a regulator in terms of ownership. But as we're speaking right now, you know, that is also still being held up in Parliament in the UK. We're still kind of 2-3 years away from seeing anything in terms of what that actually looks like. So it is very much a long-term position in play. And I guess for current owners and for prospective owners or investors looking to buy into that particular industry, one thing that they should be considering is a good detailed look at what the regulation's shaping up like so that they know what they have to deliver to get into the market, and they know what they're going to have to be checked upon when they're in that position. So I think it will be interesting moving forward. But in many ways, as I say, to answer the first part of your question, there are already very big players in and owning football clubs. We talk about the PIF as an example at Newcastle, Abu Dhabi at Manchester City, and we know Qatar as well in the Middle East have been looking at buying an English football club. We talk about the American investment. It is much bigger than football, and again, I think there's a kind of a realistic awareness point on that we have to mention, because it's not just about the football anymore. It's sometimes something a lot bigger than that. That's not to say that that's particularly wrong. That's just where we are with it. But certainly, again, kind of going back to the owner's motives piece as well, they've got to be aware of the regulation in whatever league or club they're looking at and be aware of that ecosystem moving forward.
I think this response is the perfect segue to our next segment, which is about governance and power. So again, coming back to the fan-led review, it found that 81% of fans support a golden share for giving fans a veto right over the key decisions. What you were speaking about owners. Is this the future of club governance? There are also football industry is an intricate network of various actors, state actors, corporate actors, and it's not only what fans will want or like, but also what the law says about corporations and about investments. How to balance this act, because it's too much fan influence, but also too little would be harmful for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It is that balance again, isn't it? You're absolutely right. And if you look at how that's evolved with the fan-led review, you know, there were suggestions that maybe that we should have fans on boards, and that was quickly, the clubs definitely don't want that for various reasons, and you can understand some of those in that commercial world, in that, you know, that business focused world. So there's a balance to be struck there, and I think, you know, if we look at English football as we're talking with the fan-led review, a lot of what I've dealt with, certainly with the media questions, is, we need to be more like the German model. And that does give fans a very powerful veto vote, ultimately. They don't technically own the club. It's not ownership per se. There's a bit of a myth around the model itself, but they do have that power to influence big decisions, and we've seen that work really well for German football clubs. You can't just retrospectively fit that model into English football. It wouldn't work. The same thing as, you know, we're looking at American sports and saying, we should bring in some of their governance principles. It doesn't work because you're not comparing like for like, and you can't retrospectively fit things over that level of history. But what you can do, and to go back to your golden share point there, you can give fans a powerful enough voice so that on the big decisions they will be consulted upon, and even the definition of consulted upon is very intricate. We have to be clear on whether it's consultation or deliverance of a message, because they can be very different. You can just be telling fans something rather than consulting, so there is a bit of nuance in that. But ultimately, Martin, I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier on in the conversation. Fans are really passionate about a few things with their club. They don't like you to change the club badge. They don't like you to change the club colours that they play in. They're a little bit concerned about stadium name changes, but they're open to new stadia. So there's little things there, and I think that the heritage and the badge and the colours, if an owner doesn't change those three things, I do think there's scope to do other commercial ventures and things like that the fans are okay with. They might not like it per se, but it goes back to your corporate point there. If that's bringing money in and it's revenue diversification, which can then go into helping the playing side of things and goes into the transfer market and helps the club grow, or we've moved to a new stadium and it gives us more income. We sign a stadium naming rights deal on the new stadium because there's no history attached to the name. Okay with those things because they can see the value. What really upsets them is if they try and change badges, colours, things like that. But we have seen badge changes as well. So I think it just comes back to that balance. And with that golden share, I do think we might see something like that, kind of an overall veto for a representation of fans to be communicated on, and then they can have the voice of the fans and ultimately not make that decision go through. But I do think it'll be on the really critical things around heritage, club colours and things like that, rather than, oh, should we do a deal with a commercial partner in South Korea? Because ultimately the answer to that is, well, if it delivers business opportunity, then yes, that's fine. So I think it is really a balance, and I think we're likely to see it come in, but on the level of, you know, how much you need to consult and what decisions fans have the ultimate veto on, I think that'll be interesting as well.
Right. So just to go further on this point about where is the balance? In the fan-led review, it's also mentioned that 64% of fans would like to see a referendum when it comes to stadium sales. So in your understanding, where is that balance when it comes to making a decision about whether a stadium should be sold? For instance, with Manchester United, we've just seen that Sir Jim Ratcliffe was able to, basically get buy-in from stakeholders. The best decision was to basically move out of Old Trafford and recreate another stadium with the regeneration program also. But for other lower league teams or in the EFL, where do you think the balance is? I know some club owners sell the stadiums to themselves because of FFP or PSR to basically try to engineer the finances. Where is that balance if a club understands that we need to meet a financial sort of like fair play threshold, but at the same time we need to also comply with the social contract of the fan base to try to make sure we bring them in or try and get the consent. But you need to find a very tight balance to walk that road. And where does that balance come from?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to mention that the stadium sale point that you just made. If we look at that through financial sustainability of a club should own their own stadium. Absolutely. It's their single biggest physical asset. It's probably only one of two. There's the ground and the training ground or any other space that you own. So the club absolutely needs to own its ground. The only reason we've seen clubs in the lower leagues, as you mentioned, sell their grounds mostly to their owners or through various third parties, the only reason they've done that is to comply with financial regulation, profit and sustainability as is in the Championship. And we saw a lot of Championship clubs in England do that a few years ago and get points deductions, and some of them were punished for that. But the challenge then of the club not owning its own asset comes back to hurt you in a sale kind of conversation, because if the current owner wants to sell, then the ground's not owned by the club, and you have that kind of, where does that lie in the valuation? So it becomes really problematic and it hurts the club, but the club have only done it to try and comply with the regulations. But then there's the question of why have they breached the regulations? And they've breached the regulations by trying to overspend, principally to try and get promotion to the next league up, where the financial rewards are higher. So I guess my answer to that, in a kind of roundabout way as we're talking here, is we can't just look at the balance of selling a stadium as one particular thing in isolation, because it's a product of a much bigger conversation about financial sustainability, governance, regulation. And you can then kind of see some, and the fan-led review is not perfect. It was never going to be. The independent regulator is not perfect. It was never going to be, because a lot of those fans that have answered that question in that way will be fans of clubs where it's happened, and now they're left with a club that doesn't own their stadium. But they're also, at the same time, some of those fans would have been wanting the owner to invest, to push on and compete on the pitch. So it's that piece colliding again on the bigger look at how you run a football club sustainably, whilst also trying to be competitive on the pitch. And I think ultimately it's never going to be perfect, because what fans want is to win every game of football and to be brilliant on and off the pitch, but that's not going to happen. So you're trying to find the best version of an imperfect situation. But principally speaking, for me, a football club should own its stadium. If it chooses to move to a new one, absolutely fine. And there's revenue generating opportunities. I get that. And I think most fans would be on board with that if you communicate in that in a way that, the fans can get on board with. Things do evolve and history changes. I know Manchester United fans will be feeling that, they'll have a very big historical attachment to Old Trafford, but they've also said it's falling down. It needs some renovation, and it's not had that for years. And actually, you can spin that the other way, and some of the fans might actually like that all the history is contained within Old Trafford, and actually this new stadium is going to be new. And it's about a different phase of the football club. So it is that tricky balance that we're talking about. But I think financially speaking, a club should own its stadium, and some of the reasons why they've sold those stadiums is to comply with the regulation. So you get that governance and regulatory piece just clashing again.
So yeah, thank you for that clarification. Just to digress a little bit, there was a very small piece from this network, the new American network, I think CBS, basically where Jerry Carragher, Mike Richards, and Thierry Henry on that show. And they did a piece where Thierry Henry was basically taking his kids to see where Highbury used to be, which is now like a bunch of apartments. And, he was so emotional. This came out yesterday. And as we're speaking, Arsenal won 3-0. So he was so emotional. He felt, you could tell he felt it wasn't right, but it had to be done because of the commercial reasons. So this leads me to my question. If we consider the veto power the fans could potentially have when it comes to clubs moving their stadiums, for instance, Wimbledon's relocation or Arsenal moving to the Emirates, are we then romanticizing the fan control within the game?
Yeah, that's the counter question, isn't it? And that is really important again to consider. And ultimately, I mentioned earlier, around at one point we were talking about fan representation on boards or groups of fans, and it doesn't work because every fan will have slightly different opinion on things. We could ask 20 fans to pick the team on a Saturday, and they'd all probably come up with different players, different formations. So that's what the clubs were wary of with this. And you're absolutely right that what the clubs don't want as well, and the owners and the club in that kind of same bracket, you don't want the fans kind of vetoing those decisions that would push on, increase the commercial opportunities, increase revenue. Ultimately, that again goes back to me for the communications piece. I would like to think that it wouldn't play out that way, because the message of clarity from the board to the fans would be, these are the reasons why we need to do this. And in Arsenal's case, it was right, we've outgrown that stadium. We can fill a bigger stadium twice over, and then we can do a naming rights deal. Then we can host other events there. We're talking about the plans for Manchester United, but look at what Tottenham Hotspur have done with that stadium. Again, an NFL deal, a Formula One go-karting track underneath the stadium, Taylor Swift concerts, Beyonce concerts. It's much bigger again than football. I think we're talking about fan vetoes, but ultimately that's still going to be in the context of the representation of that fan decision would be within the kind of supporters trust or the affiliated fan group of the club. So I think that adds some weight to it, that everyone's there to kind of make sensible decisions for the betterment of the club, because it's not just the fans in general, and it's not looking at the social media comments boards and all kind of manner of things that we see. It's a group of fans that have been elected by the wider fan base, have a direct line into the club. The communication between supporters group and club is much better. So therefore those conversations can happen in a positive way, where if it does need to be a stadium move, then ultimately I don't think the fans would veto that kind of thing. I genuinely don't, but I do think they would veto, we want to change the colours of the kit, or we want to rebrand the badge. Those are the really kind of tricky items from a culture and heritage point of view. But if you're talking about building a new stadia or expanding stadia, then most fans nowadays understand that sometimes that's necessary to try and compete with the biggest clubs, and there is a competition gap. There are kind of big clubs and they are dominating, so there's only so many ways in which you can try and keep up and bridge the gap, and stadium expansion and new stadia is one of those things.
Right. So you just mentioned a very interesting term, competition. So now transitioning to the economics of competition when it comes to the football industry, one of your papers, and I must say, like, we had a very good time going through your papers, very insightful. But one of your papers basically mentioned calling for the abolishment of parachute payments, and basically showing the double promotion chances for regulated clubs, a disadvantage of clubs who don't benefit from parachute payments. And also, concurrently, we see that 49% of fans are against these parachute payments. I'm guessing they're from opposite club fans. So, in your expertise or understanding of the industry, why hasn't this parachute payment system been abolished yet?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's very kind. We've always tried, myself and my colleagues have always tried to make that research, to give that some dissemination in the wider landscape. And it's great to be invited onto things like this. And I work with aspiring sporting directors and speak within the industry as well. So it's great that kind of research is getting out there and putting that message forward. Our job is to put that evidence forward, and I think what we've seen with parachute payments, and we have consulted for the English Football League on this as well as a direct result of that paper you mentioned. So it has been fascinating to get underneath the surface of it in a little bit more detail. I guess the direct answer to your question as to why that's not changed is ultimately we're back to governance again. So they are a Premier League. It's within the governance terms of the Premier League. They are a payment that is given to relegated clubs for 3 years at the moment post relegation, and to change that ruling to not give that money, let's say, needs a member vote of 14 clubs in the Premier League to say we'll stop it. It's not an EFL decision per se, an English Football League decision per se. The simple reason, therefore, is that clubs will not vote to change that, because there's a lot of clubs in the Premier League that know they are only one bad season away from catastrophe. And we've had that recently. You look at Everton, an ever-present club in the Premier League, have been on the brink of relegation in recent years whilst trying to move to a new stadium, and the finances have been in a real mess. Leicester City were Premier League champions one year in Europe, and they've been relegated back up, but are now likely to drop straight away again. So it's those clubs that when they're in the Premier League table, they're not going to vote for something that's going to hurt them should they get relegated, and that's why it hasn't happened. But the other side of that coin, as the researchers been trying to position the argument, is it does then create problems in the Championship, and you get the kind of haves and the have-nots, and they're twice, 3 times more likely in some cases in any given season to go back up to the Premier League while they've got parachute payments, and we've seen that percentage chance increase over the years as the value of parachute payments has increased as well. So whilst clubs are being a bit more prudent nowadays, which is a good thing, and building in wage reduction clauses if they do get relegated, that's absolutely what they should be doing. Our argument's always been, if that was commonplace in the industry to do wage reduction clauses and bonuses the other way, then you don't really need parachute payments, because you're running sustainably within your own model, so you're in control of your costs dependent on the league that you move in between. But it certainly has caused problems for competitive balance in the Championship. It's harder for some of those clubs behind the parachute payment clubs to bridge that gap. They then potentially gamble on financial sustainability to try and land the jackpot. So there's a couple of things within that, as always. It's clubs kind of voting in their own interest rather than collective action. And I think there's a perception, certainly across the wider fan demographic, that clubs should be looking after each other, but that's not the reality of it. They'll vote in their own interests. And also because the gap between the Championship and the Premier League in English football is so great, 120 million is the minimum gap in revenue terms. If you've not been there for a while, that's the gap that we're talking. It's really tricky to bridge that gap, and you've got parachute payment clubs that are already, a year one payment at the minute is £42 million or thereabouts. You have a situation in that league every single season where you have 3 clubs that are £42 million ahead of the rest. And then we look at the league tables and we go, right, there's a little bit of a problem there, because we've got clubs going up that struggle to compete, and if you look at the table again, as we're talking right now, the Premier League, Southampton have already been relegated. Leicester and Ipswich are pretty much cut adrift at the bottom. They were the three that went up. And if we look at the top of the Championship, Leeds United, who didn't go straight back up but have got parachute payments, Burnley, who went down and will probably go straight back up, Sheffield United, and those clubs are kind of 13 points ahead of fourth place and 20 to 30 points ahead of those fighting for the final playoff spot. So that kind of repeat scenario happening year on year, which more often than not it does, is a real problem in that league. But again, it comes back to wider issues around the financial gap between leagues in English football, the governance, the regulatory practices, and how clubs vote on these things as well in their own interest.
So you were speaking, Professor Dan, about how fan engagement drives growth, and with the EFL matching the EPL's cultural pull, despite what you also mentioned about the revenue gap. So we're looking at 300 million revenue versus 30 million revenue, something like that on that. How can clubs monetize this loyalty without alienating supporters?
It's what a lot of clubs are trying to do at the minute. And again, we're back to that kind of conversation about balance. But I think what all clubs are looking at, and again, this kind of chimes to the cultural piece in English football, that a lot of the clubs, even in the Championship, as you say, or the lower end of the Championship, even into League One and League Two, they can claim significant fan bases around the world. They have fans and followers in all parts of the world. And of course, the biggest clubs have the bigger fan base in terms of global fan base, and the number of fans that Manchester United claim as an example, he's always going to be far greater than a kind of mid-table Championship club. But it's about how they can engage with fans in a different way and monetize that global fan base as well. And all clubs are looking at that. They absolutely are, because again, if you go back to the ticket prices and the stadium conversation, there's only that gives you a finite level of income. There's only so many seats you can sell, even if you can sell them, and there will be a tipping point on the price you can charge. And unless you build a new stadium, all you're doing is squeezing ticket prices up every year. So it's about how you engage with fans in other ways. And I think what we're seeing, particularly again at the kind of uber elite level, but also other clubs are trying to look at similar initiatives, is how do we get to know our fans better, that they're not just an email on a database. How do we tailor content to them behind the scenes, direct to consumer, subscription models, apps, services, in club type productions? How do we engage better with the technological advancements around the world, the metaverse, all that stuff about how you can engage with your fans better is what clubs are looking at. There's a resource angle to that. You have to have the resource to be able to go and do that, which again is where the bigger clubs will win out ultimately. It's tapping into the fans in a new way. And we mentioned earlier around the new generation of fans and how they engage differently. They're shorter content. They prefer highlights packages to watching a full game. They follow superstars. Maybe they follow clubs, but they certainly follow superstars, and they want engagement with that. You may have seen the Baller League as an example, and those kind of indoor leagues that are the Kings League. There's YouTube influencers in there. I remember a few weeks ago there was a charity game at Wembley Stadium in England, and it was full, and it was all YouTube influencers and social media stars, and kids and younger generations were tuning in to watch those players. It wasn't about a team, it was about those people. And that's where we'll see some of this dynamic change a little bit in the next few years. But it's absolutely about that direct to consumer model and how you engage better with the fan base. And we could look at Wrexham as the kind of a big example there in English football, with again their reach into America and Hollywood, but the Disneyfication of that, the documentaries, that kind of thing. So it's a way to drive revenue, but it's also a way to drive engagement with your fan base and the next generation of fans as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's a recent interview that Felix, the CEO of Baller League, had with the show, basically where he mentioned this whole theory around team-led versus hero-led. So clubs or football fans are more driven by heroes' stories, so Mbappe, Vinicius and Bellingham and the likes, versus following teams. And you see that with a lot of individuals like Ronaldo having more followers on Instagram than clubs themselves. And this has been going on for a while, and this is a running theme. So I do agree with that statement. Just before we close this segment, we do have this question around considering the parachute payments that you mentioned, the Premier League being the behemoth that it is within the English tier system, do you consider the hoarding of the TV deals, parachute payment deals, as a significant threat to the English 4-tier system in the future?
Not a threat, no. I think we've seen the growth of the Premier League, and we should be applauding that, and rightly so. I don't think the Premier League in 1992 really thought that they would have the growth in revenue terms and become the league that they are now in 2025. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, and it has been super successful, and some of that money has then been passed down to the Football League as well. So I don't see it as a threat, but I do agree with your point absolutely on. I think it's always likely to be a sticking point, and we go back to the independent regulator here. Part of that conversation has always been about financial distribution from Premier League to Football League, and they've never agreed recently on the number. So they've signed deals in the past where there's a solidarity payment from the Premier League down into those leagues, and each club in the Champions League 1 and League 2 has had a bit of that money. And the deal's always been done, but the deal now is a sticking point. The EFL, we were led to believe, wanted 25% of the total pot. There was an offer on the table for 19% that was rejected. So you're kind of into conversations about, okay, what's the number that everybody's happy with? And that will continue to be a sticking point. And it's part of the reason why the independent regulator will be given backstop powers to step in if those two organisations can't agree that deal. I would say there's a deal to be done. Of course, there always is. Nobody quite knows where that's going to land yet. I wouldn't necessarily see it as a threat at this point in time, but I do think it will continue to be a sticking point, especially with the broadcast money going up. The domestic deals in England have, the Premier League in particular, the domestic deal is flatlined a little bit in the last two cycles, but the overseas deal has not only outstripped the domestic value, but it's grown in the last two cycles. So that shows you where the demand is, and that's why the Premier League are so intent at driving growth in the international market. And that goes back to the wider fan piece, etc. And again, whenever there's more money than in the total pot, it's likely that the clubs underneath in the English Football League would want more of that pot. I understand that, but it's not just as simple as giving them more money as well. It has to come with cost controls. What you spend that money on is important as well, because there is a reality, as we're saying, that even if you gave a League Two club an extra £5 million from the TV deal, they might just go and spend that on players, and that's not sustainable either. So yeah, it'll continue to be a sticking point, I think, as the independent regulator sets up in the background and this deal's to be thrashed out based on the TV cycles.
Very insightful indeed. We're now transitioning to our last segment, which is about or regarding ownership, valuation, and the future of football. One reality is that stock market clubs had better liquidity and less debt than private equity or foreign owners dominated clubs in the present. Is this shift the root of football's unsustainable practices? And I know your research talks about this.
Yeah, in part, yes, and the numbers would kind of back that up to a degree. Again, I think it depends on what type of ownership model we're looking at, and also then who is the owner and their individual motives. One of the most famous ones that we always go back to is Roman Abramovich at Chelsea in 2003, in a time where there was no financial regulation, no FFP, quickly delivered 2 league titles, but spent enormous amounts of money on the transfer, on players and wages, and that club then became loss-making, fairly high losses during that time. But for him, again, it wasn't about a return on investment. For him, it was a trophy asset. He wanted to win titles. He wanted to be on the photos holding up the trophies. So that motive there was about, well, I'll just spend what I need to spend to make this club win titles. That can push the club into financially unsustainable positions. Of course it can. And there are other examples that we can talk to, but there are other ownership models that don't do that. There are ownership models that look to run the club sustainably. Within their means, they'll invest to a degree, but they won't overstretch. Fast forward to now, and we've got private equity is the big one at the minute, alongside the sovereign state wealth funds, who of course have other agendas, as we spoke about as well. But the model of private equity is to buy a distressed asset, or to buy an asset cheap and flip it and deliver a return on investment, and then have an exit strategy that delivers return for shareholders and investors. English football clubs are seen very much in the American market as undervalued assets, or rather assets with further growth potential. So it's cheaper to buy an English football club or a European football club than it is to buy an NBA franchise. So there's a lot of dynamics there underneath the type of ownership models and what they're looking at doing. But certainly if we kind of go back 20 years and look at what is then and kind of what is now, there is enough evidence to suggest that, yeah, some of the ways in which owners have operated has pushed clubs towards being financially unsustainable. And I've always said with owners, there's one thing I always come back to is I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. If you look at the club perspective, it's not a bad thing for an owner to invest money into a football club. And if an owner wants to run that club at a loss to a degree, that has been historical as well in English football. There is an over-reliance point on owners that we need to be mindful of. And it's almost like it's okay to go down that road, but because of two things. One, that the owner's still interested, and two, that they have enough money to keep footing the bill. And if you lose either one of those things or both, then that's when you hit problems. So yeah, I think again it comes back to individual motives and types of ownership models and how that affects the income statement and the balance sheet.
And actually, this is one of like the main concerns or main topics that the FSR addresses right now, how to make football clubs more sustainable. But is there a one size fit all solution, or would we have just to depend on the team, depending on the owner, depending on the fan base, on the league?
Yeah, I don't think there is a one size fits all solution, and I think we can see in the conversation we've had how it's always multi-layered, because you have to kind of ask yourself the nuclear question at the end of the scale there. So if Club A, as an example, is really reliant on one person and it's loss making, and that person is propping up the finances, is paying the wage bills, etc., it's subsidising the club. If you remove that person, the club can't survive. It hasn't got enough income to cover its costs. So the change in ownership thing to try and make clubs financially sustainable is all clubs should be striving for me to be sustainable in their own right, but that comes at a cost. And ultimately what that means is you can't spend as much on players as clubs have been doing. You have to live within your means. That might mean that you're less competitive on the pitch for a period of time. And the other problem then within this industry, as we're alluding to, is everybody's desperate to compete and close a gap, and everybody wants to win a football match and move up the league table. But not everybody will be trying to be financially sustainable unless they're regulated to the nth degree that they have to be. So if you choose to be sustainable at the minute as a club, it can be quite problematic for your on-pitch performance, because there's maybe 3 or 4, 7 or 8, 9 or 10 other clubs in that league that are not doing that. So you then run the risk of falling behind. And that to me goes back to that answer of there is no one-size-fits-all model. We should be striving more for financial sustainability at club level. But that has to be looked at in terms of a cost base, which is mostly player wages, and a growth model moving forward that is sustainable. But ultimately, I think you run the risk then of kind of putting yourself in a group of clubs that has a ceiling. And again, I don't think fans like to think that their club has a ceiling. They like to think that their club can be the Leicester, and it's just not feasible for all. So it goes back to that again at the fan piece as well. And we should also mention there, just lastly, the players as well, and the governance thing again, and how it all collides. Because just mentioning some examples in the lower leagues, during the COVID pandemic in England, there was a deal on the table for League One and League Two to bring in a salary cap, which was 2.5 million per club in League One, 1.5 million in League Two, and the majority of clubs agreed to it. But the players went to the Professional Footballers Association, and the PFA said to the clubs, you can't do this because you're capping player earnings. And the PFA actually almost kicked it out as well. So again, there's no one size fits all answer. You have to consider kind of all the moving parts.
Yeah, when it comes to salary caps, so I think it's well understood that salaries have outpaced inflation in the football industry generally, but we also have to be mindful in terms of understanding that what generates this industry are the players for the most part. They are the lifeblood of the industry, and if they're seeing salaries from other entertainment industries, specifically all the sports adjacent industries like the NBA, the NFL, and yes, in revenues per charge, especially because of the commercialization of the American market, it's fair to understand that on the European side of things, they would rather have that also not be left behind. So where is that balance where we want to make sure clubs are sustainably run, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we have the best ability to invite the most talented youths to basically continue to sustainably grow the industry? That's the first part of my question. The second part is basically around what do you think about the potential growth model around focusing on commercialization and getting closer to the fan engagement side of things, as opposed to over reliance on broadcasting deals, on match day tickets. What would also be your take on that?
Yeah. So completely agree with you on player salaries. I think we were talking briefly earlier about the new financial sustainability regulations that UEFA have brought in. It's likely that the Premier League will follow suit as well. Other leagues in Europe, not sure, but maybe they do for consistency purposes in the future. And if you look at what that's designed to do, particularly the squad cost ratio, so that's going to be a catch-all number which covers wages, transfer fees, amortised agents' fees, manager salaries as well. And UEFA are going to set that at 70% of turnover by 25-26 season. So we're in that transition period now between old FFP for UEFA, new FSRs. And if you look at that, if clubs conform to that ratio in time, and I know that's the clubs that compete in Europe, which we can come on to in a minute, but that will go some way to helping the player wage situation against club turnover. Now, I've got absolutely no issue with players being paid a good wage. Not a problem. They are absolute superstars, and I completely take your point, Ibrahim, about the need to have those to sell the product. That's what this is based upon. It's star quality, and I've got no issue with players earning a good wage. What's a challenge for the clubs is when those players are earning a wage that pushes the wage bill higher than the turnover of the club. That's the problem. So the bigger clubs are okay with this again. It's not the Manchester Uniteds or the Arsenals or the Liverpools or the Bayern Munichs or the Real Madrids. They'll conform with that UEFA ratio because their revenue's much higher and they can manage their cost base. So the players will still get good salaries, but they'll be okay. It's clubs further down that are gambling to try and bridge that gap. So that's where you run into problems with player wages. And of course, we're talking that, as I said, that ruling is for principally clubs competing in UEFA competitions. But what about the clubs that aren't? And that's where we might see some unsustainable wages still, which is a problem. So I think with the wage conversation, for me, again, however you can make that work so that the cost base is sustainable, I think is important. And whether that means that you have to make wage reduction clauses mandatory, which you could do, depending on, and also promotion bonuses as well. It works both ways to bridge the gap. That's a solution, maybe. So yeah, I think that's the balance on player wages. It's around the regulations, but also it needs to be sustainable at club level would be my take on it. And that does kind of segue nicely in to try and answer your second question, because what, of course, in a cost-based level, and if we're talking sustainable, and player wages are still the single biggest cost, if a club can increase the revenue line, then they might be able to pay the players more or sign that player or increase the wage bill. And if you look at the ways a football club gets its money, we've talked about them at length already, but there's only three ways. One is match day, one is broadcasting, and one is commercial in those kind of broad brackets. And we've talked about how the match day income has a limit because it's linked to physical stadia at the moment still. The broadcast deals, you're absolutely right, the clubs aren't in direct control over those. The broadcasters and the league negotiate, and then the clubs will get the payment. So there's a risk factor in that. It's unearned income to a degree for those clubs. So the way they've been looking to stretch the margin is commercial, because there's no restriction on the amount of commercial deals you can sign. That's completely done between club and partner. That comes into how you engage better with the fans as well. There's commercial partnerships and tie into that. So we've seen clubs actively target that commercial bracket of income generation through new methods to diversify income and to grow income. So I think it's likely we see that continue, because of, as you say, the over-reliance on broadcasting is, again, not a problem for the biggest clubs, but it's a problem for the mid-table Premier League clubs where you've got 70-80% of revenue is broadcasting. And if you get relegated, you lose a big chunk of that. So it's those clubs that are kind of most at risk with that. But all the clubs, again, are also trying to do the same things. And then you come back to that thing of, right, so some clubs are always going to win slightly more than others in that regard because they've got more power to sign bigger commercial contracts. They're more attractive to global partners, etc. But all clubs should be looking at commercialisation strategies to try and grow that revenue line. And if they do grow that revenue line, then the cost base can increase a little bit as a result. I guess what we've seen historically in a lot of clubs is the other way. The cost base has been higher than the revenue line. And then you've got the owner again footing the bill, which is the unsustainable stuff that we've talked about.
Great. Very, very insightful. So you mentioned a few things: cost-based, revenue line, commercial, owners. So like my question basically, we touch on all of that, and it's about the football industry when it comes to women's football. As we all know, women's football is tremendously growing, it's booming. So I think Brighton have basically built a new women's stadium, which is remarkable. And then Chelsea recently valued their stadium at, the women's football team at 200 million pounds. And then that's off the back of $9 million revenue. What's your perception of this? Is this a bubble? Is this just financial engineering from Todd Bowley and his team? We understand the intention is obviously to be compliant with FFP or PSR, but what is the understanding of this tremendously high valuation?
Yeah, no. So two really good examples there. So I'll deal with both of those in turn, and then we can talk more broadly about women's football and the growth potential. So the two examples you mentioned there, Brighton for me would be a good example of how to facilitate good growth with their women's team and in the wider game. So a purpose-built facility for now, as the demand is right now, but also then with the expectation that hopefully you could grow that. And we saw a really good example in English Rugby Union a few years ago with Exeter. What they did was to build new parts of their stadium onto the stadium when they got promoted through the leagues and demand for seats was higher. And it was a really good strategy of, we know where we're at right now. We know this is the amount of seats we can fill. But if we do better and the growth comes with it, we can start to build on new parts of that stadium. So I think with women's football, that example, purpose built for now is the way to go for a lot of those clubs, because some of them can sell out the big stadium that's attached to the men's team. Some can't. So it's good strategies for where you're at in terms of your club, and not just looking at the Arsenals, the Manchester Uniteds, the Manchester Cities again in women's football, because they are already well ahead of the rest. So the Brighton example is a good one. The Chelsea one, you've just called it. That is principally about PSR compliance for the whole group, principally the men's team. The women's team is not worth 200 million. At this point in time, it puts it higher than some women's soccer franchises in America, where there has been big growth and there's revenue protection around that because of the way the league's structured, and they've got big investors. And Angel City is the example that we could look at. Angel City women's team is Chelsea have just valued their women's team slightly higher. They're not. It's not that Angel City is in far better shape than Chelsea women's team as a individual team, and that's not doing a disservice to Chelsea women's team. That's just the reality of the valuation. So that all becomes about PSR compliance. And if you look at that valuation and look at some of the the highest revenue generating women's teams in Europe, it's higher than the cumulative total of like the top 7 or 8. It's not even a valuation that's close. So it's purely about PSR compliance. And that's not great, because it skews the perception of kind of what's going on in that particular space. So there's absolutely no doubt there's growth in women's football, and it should be targeting that good incremental growth. A lot of people have said, including myself, it shouldn't be looking at the men's game as a blueprint. Absolutely not. It needs to grow in its own right. It needs to find different ways to engage with different audiences as well, new audiences. I attended some of the women's Euros in this country with my young family, and it was such a different atmosphere and positioning and setting to watching some of the men's games, and they've got to tap into that and find a way to make that work as well from an audience perspective. Keeping some of the free-to-air broadcasting still is important while it's in those growth phases, because you don't want to put it solely behind a paywall, but you need that money from Sky Sports and others as an example. So there's a broadcasting balance. And then again, the commercial side of things, leveraging different partnerships with different companies and brands that have not been involved in the men's game, but have there's a different brand proposition and a leveraging proposition for the women's game as well. So I think if they can get some of those things firing in the future, and again, I know the American model of sport's very different, as we've alluded to, but you could look at some of the blueprints there in terms of how some of those women's franchises have achieved growth so far and the valuations that they're already commanding. There is success to be had there, but it needs to be that incremental, sustainable, grow with the market, grow with the demand. That's tricky because everyone wants to move at 100 miles an hour. But what you're trying to do here with the women's game for me is protect the long-term future of it, so that the decisions that are made now put the game and its clubs in the best position in 20 years' time. Owners and investors are a part of that as well, and look at some of the people that, as we say, Angel City, look at Michelle Kang, and they're a different type of investor and a different type of person that want to be connected with women's football, and there's some real power to harness in that, and especially not in the case of what Chelsea have done, as we've alluded to, but if you can get that brand proposition then working between women's team, men's team, overall group and beyond, that can be really powerful in the future as well. But it's long-term growth for me, I think, is what I'm trying to say there.
Just one closing question before our rapid fire segment. Professor Dan, what keeps you hopeful about football's financial future? Because we've discussed a lot about the challenges, but what keeps you hopeful?
Yeah, I think the fact that I go back to the first conversation we had, I think because so many people care about it, there's an emotive angle to everything we've talked about there, whether that's investors that want to be involved with it for whatever reasons, but they want to be involved and that they're trying to do. I genuinely think most owners set out with the intention of doing good. Sometimes it doesn't work out, but everyone's kind of got good intentions. Everybody that's involved in the game loves to win football matches, owners, players, fans. There is a collective goal there of what the game's all about, and I think and then putting regulations in place, albeit there have been criticisms of regulations, but people are trying to protect clubs, trying to protect the game, trying to protect players. There is such a global sport that, again, there's no other sport like it, and that's the kind of power within it. So I think, generally speaking, that's why we're all hopeful that the future of football is a bright one. And again, we should be also making the point that a lot of it is bright. We do kind of focus in on some of the horror stories. We do focus in on financial sustainability, mismanagement. And again, I've said before, if there's a world where every club makes a profit and wins every game on a Saturday, I'm probably not in the job that I'm in. We are talking about some of the issues which will remain and need investigating. But I do think the game has a bright future. I think it's got big strategic challenges coming up. And I have said as well that with all the things we spoke about, and we mentioned the Premier League in '92 as the catalyst for huge change in English football, I think it feels like certainly in English football at the minute, which will have repercussions to the wider European landscape, it really does feel like we're at a bit of a crossroads or a tipping point. And I think what happens next could, as I say, shape the next 20, 30 years. And there's an opportunity there. It's quite a powerful opportunity. But there's also a few warning signs that we need to be mindful of still.
Yeah. So just to follow back on that, so in terms of the financial risks going forward for football clubs, well, first thing would be, what would you say has been the most significant financial decisions that have happened in the football industry, and where do you see the risks from that going forward?
Yeah, we have to focus on player wages as part of that. They are still the single biggest cost. That's not changed throughout history, really, but the cost base has increased, and the big shift in the last 30 years, it's becoming unsustainable at certain clubs and the challenges that we've talked about. So player costs are still a challenge. And then also the regulatory piece over the top, I would keep coming back to that because, as I said earlier, there's a lot of people, myself included, that would say that we shouldn't need regulation in the football industry. It should be able to do it itself. But it can't, because clubs will continue to vote in their own interest rather than this collective action. So, and the problem then with regulation is, in many ways, it's always going to be anti-competitive to somebody as well. So those are the two things that I would keep coming back to, for good and for bad. Those are still some of the challenges within the industry, and that does create winners and losers. And again, one of the good things we mentioned a minute ago with, where's the hope and the future is, there is a scenario where a Leicester City winning the Premier League could still happen, but it happens once every 50 years. And I think that, we have to accept that we are where we are at the minute, but it's whether we're okay with that. We're okay with certain clubs dominating more often than not. And I think that, again, I'm talking about all this at a time where the broadcast money's never been higher. There's still a lot of star players wanting to play in the European game in particular. Champions League is the pinnacle of club football. The whole show rolls on. So they probably don't think they've got a problem to solve, but I think there are some challenges that we need to be mindful of in the future.
Professor Dan, two final questions. One from me, one from Ibrahim. What's the most iconic financial decision in football history?
What a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I think if I focus my answer on the Premier League, I think that the decision to the sanction of the Premier League itself, because that was a breakaway league. in all but name, and it was touch and go as to whether or not it would happen, but the big clubs won out and voted that one in, and now we're looking at all the numbers we're talking about now, certainly in English football, but it's tough in Europe because you've got other leagues that are so far behind and trying to keep pace and bridge the gap. So yeah, I think in English football terms, certainly the vote to start that Premier League and what it has become, we perhaps never saw how big it would be.
Right. So the final question would be, what's the most significant sports finance book that has influenced you, your career, and the way you see the sports industry?
That's another good question I've probably not been asked. So I remember there's a bookshelf behind me in my office as we're talking, but we're in an office move, so it's about to get cleared out. I remember when I first started studying this subject as an undergraduate student, was the work of Stefan Szymanski and those books about soccernomics. It just captured me in terms of, I've always loved sport, I've always played sport, watched sport, but now understanding that through a different lens around the business side of it and how it affects the economics of competition. So yeah, that his was probably one of the first books I ever read, and he's still very much going strong in America and all the work that he's done. So yeah, one of the biggest names in the field at the time I was getting involved and still to this day. So yeah, I remember reading a lot of his work when I was studying this as an undergraduate.
Professor Dan, that was an incredible deep dive into football's financial soul, we would call it. Thanks for breaking it all down for us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Great to be on.
Right. And thank you so much to Professor Dan. And that's episode 2 in the books of the football economy. Huge thanks to Professor Dan again for his insights on governance, finance, and the fan factor. If you've enjoyed this, please hit the subscribe button and join us next time for more on the business of the beautiful game. See you soon. Bye.